Hey everyone, this is Luke with Luke F1 Fantasy. Welcome back to the channel. This is my team selection video for the United States Grand Prix, which is coming up this weekend. And of course, it is a sprint weekend as well, so we have an extra qualifying and an extra race, one extra session of scoring for the entire weekend. It's going to be a fun one. So my video today is going to cover a little bit of talk about analyzing the team from Singapore. We will look into transfer targets as well as some team selections and a little bit of touching on our strategy thoughts as we progress into this last quarter of the season now. Let's rewind to Singapore and talk about the wild card chip play. It was a big call, but one that I felt made sense longer term. Looking at the team that I wanted to get into after free practice 2 was definitely a situation for me where I wanted to get Max into the team. And in order for that really to happen, I needed to make 4 changes, which would have cost me a massive minus 40 points. So the wild card was in play for me. And the team structure I opted to go for included Max and Oscar as my 2 A-tier drivers, which meant that I had to downgrade my constructor from Ferrari to Mercedes, which was a great week to do it, seeing the data in the practice, and obviously Russell and Snelly having a great weekend. That combo definitely made the most sense for my team after free practice 3. I still got that Mercedes coverage, which freed up the budget to lock in Max. However, I did miss out on the race win by George Russell, so kudos to all of you that had him in your team. Had I gone the Russell route, I would have ended up with a team with Piastri, Russell, McLaren, and Ferrari. And that team actually scored 18 points fewer than my wildcard team. Seeing as I had enough budget to afford Max and Oscar, that was the way to go. I did end up losing 0.2 million in team value versus the other team. But like I said, because this team got 18 points more, so got an extra 9 points per 0.1 million lost, it was a trade that I would take every time. The points wise, I did miss out on the Russell 2x, but overall, long term, I think I'm pretty happy with the foundation that I've got in the team going. All right, so looking into Austin then, well, it's shaping up to be a hot weekend. So typically with the hot weather, it's going to favor the teams such as McLaren, who have had strong tire management, low tire degradation over the long stint. So certainly looking at McLaren as being sort of a front runner for a 1-2 here, despite all the drama going off the track right now. But I think McLaren have to be a strong bet for 1 and 2. Which brings them to Ferrari, typically can struggle with tire wear, tire degradation, tire management. We've so often seen them not being able to manage how they do in qualifying, FP3 to the qualifying session. With it being a sprint weekend and things being split over different times, maybe the sprint itself gives them a little bit more data than they would normally get from an FP3. So yeah, we can look to see what Ferrari will do this weekend. The track profile, it's a fast, flowy, low downforce track, sort of Silverstone vibes. It's typically going to suit your team like Red Bull, McLaren. Mercedes may not be the best match around here, but they've looked more competitive recently, coming off some good form. In terms of constructors, I'd probably rank them as McLaren, Red Bull second, Mercedes third. And then we get to see sprint qualifying to see how things play out. On sprint weekends, this is going to expose weaknesses if you have them. Cars that are fragile or inconsistent. Hello, Alpine. There's double the chance to lose points. Something to keep in mind as we build our team. All right, let's get into this week's transfer targets and potential team setups. So looking into our Tier A drivers then, certainly from a budget building perspective, Russell needing 18 points for a 0.3 million is by far the best Tier A asset this weekend from a budget building perspective. Staff needing 32 points. I think it's going to be quite difficult for guys like Hamilton, Leclerc, Norris, and Piastri to see that max increase, needing sort of between 53 and 93 points. So even on a sprint weekend where there are extra points available for someone like Piastri, that is quite a high and lofty goal to achieve. So likely going to see some price decrease or some price stagnations in these 4 assets. Looking into our Tier B drivers, we have Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, and Liam Lawson as our 3 main drivers that are catching our eye this week for those likely to increase by 0.6 million. And if we take a look at the ownership of these assets, we have Sainz at 42% ownership across the game. We have 35% ownership for Alonso across the game. And we have Liam Lawson at 12% ownership of the game. So quite widely owned assets in Sainz and Alonso. If you have them in your team, they are great holds for this week. If you have neither of them, then one, if not both, are likely to be very enticing transfers in for your team this week. Not only because they have great budget building perspectives, but Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, and Liam Lawson have all been showing really good points. So if we look at the last 6 races from the last sprint in Spa to now, so we have Carlos Sainz averaging 9.5 points, Alonso averaging 8.2 points, and Liam Lawson averaging 7.5 points. So really decent average scores over that time. And what we also see during that time is that each of those drivers have the ability to have a spike week. So Sainz with a 33 in Azerbaijan, Alonso with a 30 in Singapore, also a 17 in Hungary, and Lawson with double digits in Hungary and Azerbaijan. So cars that are in a decent amount of form between all 3 of them in their last 6 races. You have only one DNF between all 3 of them, and that's Alonso's in Monza. But other than that, those are 3 great picks from a budget and a points perspective. Looking into the next 3 viable options, we have Pierre Gasly, Franco Colapinto, and Oliver Bearman. Not likely to see the 0.6 increase. So Gasly and Colapinto purely in here from a budget protection perspective at this point in time. Over a sprint weekend when there's double opportunities to score or lose points, having Alpines on a sprint weekend does fill me with a little bit of anxiety and nerves. So if there's an opportunity to get off these assets, if you have the chance, I would definitely be looking at those opportunities for sort of a priority for me. We have a next grouping that's actually quite an interest with Oliver Bearman, Gabi Bortoleto, and Antonelli. Now, they need between 14 or 16 points to get that massive increase of 0.6. And Antonelli in a Mercedes on a sprint, 16 points appears to be within his realm of possibilities. For a Bortoleto at 16-pointer, he's going to need one of those really good weekends. And so we have to ask ourselves, where are these assets going to get their points from? A lot of performance this year has come from Ollie Bearman with his overtake ability, as well as Gabi Bortoleto, both averaging about 3.3, 3.2 race overtakes. Seeing that over sprint and a race, there could be a path to those points. But I do think for them to really hit their targets, they also need to be getting into Q3 and possibly qualify and or finish in the top 10. So it's going to take a little bit to get to this level. It's not out the realm of possibilities. And we're going to have to look at the budget. 7.1 for Bearman, 6.1 for Bortoleto, 15.1 for Antonelli. So Antonelli may be a bit of a reach for those of us that are in the 4 build now. It's difficult to get into that third driver that's also relatively higher priced, but the return could be interesting to see how well Mercedes do suit this track. Outside of that, we have Tsunoda, Hadjar, Ocon, Stroll, Albon, Hulk. Ultimately, we get into a point where budget isn't going to be a focus for some teams. I think right now, if I'm 130, even that's probably on the higher end of that. If I'm sort of at that level, I'm probably thinking more about points. And so with sprint weekends, because we have the sprint qualifying before our team log, if you see any of these assets, Tsunoda, Stroll, Albon, be in a position where they have qualified into that top 8, the scoring positions in a sprint weekend, they may be worth a punt. You do have to consider whether they can keep up that performance over the course of the weekend. But now more so in this part of the season than the earlier part of the season, especially on a sprint weekend, there is an argument to have more of a punt on these assets that are at the bottom of our budget building perspectives. Looking at them, potentially Albon could be someone that you could look at, knowing that the Williams is still a relatively strong car. Same with Lance Stroll, has popped up with spiky performances, a 10-pointer in Singapore. Ocon, it comes down to how competitive the Haas car is going to be this weekend. They are bringing some upgrades. This is a homegrown Grand Prix for Team Haas. So there could be something on show for them this week, tune in a bit more performance, put on a show for some of the sponsors. Haas is definitely a team that I'm going to be looking at a bit more closely this weekend. So watch out for Haas this weekend. So looking into our Tier A constructors, we're never really looking at our constructors from a budget building perspective. It's just really picking who is going to be the top 2 highest scorers in that given week. McLaren is still going to be a plug and play team for us, even though they've had a couple of weekends where they haven't really shown they can win. But we have to trust in their performance all year. So still going to be part of my team. I've got Mercedes in my team. I do need to find extra budget if I need to get into a Red Bull or Ferrari. So right now I'm kind of locked into a Mercedes pick, but looking quite strong for that. And then Tier B is if you're still on a sort of a 1A constructor build. VCarb, Aston, Williams, Haas would be some of my favorite picks for this week. I do want to jump into some team selections as we look forward. So here's the team as I have it from last week. I've got 0.6 million in the bank. My 2X are max. I've got Oscar, McLaren, Mercedes is my structure, and then I have my 3 B tiers at Sainz, Bortoleto, and Gasly. Comparing it to the budget builder then, so from a priority-wise, potentially looking at Bortoleto being my most at risk to leave my team this week over Gasly, because Gasly has reached the 4.5 million floor. So he might lose me points, but he won't lose me budget. Bortoleto could do both for me. So probably looking at Bortoleto as being one of my top ones to move out. I'm not really seeing much of the points upside of that this week. If I was to take Bortoleto out, I can afford Alonso at 6.7 million. I have 6.7 million in the back here. So just with that one move, doesn't really leave me much options after that. I'm down to 0 million in the cost cap and one move to make. Actually, I can't even downgrade from a Sainz to a Lawson because Lawson's more expensive than Carlos Sainz. So there isn't really too much to do from this. I have to be happy with what free practice 1 and sprint qualifying shows me in that. The Mercedes are strong, Max looks good, and the Oscar as having a rebound. So right now there's no real reactions to make. The only way I'll be able to make any main changes with my team is removing either an Oscar or a Max from my team, which would free up a bit more budget to do other things. So if Red Bull and Max don't look as good as Mercedes and George, bringing in George for Max puts me back at 6.4 million in the bank, which then leaves me a couple options. It may be choosing which McLaren driver I want to pivot to from a Lando and Oscar, depending on who would do well. I don't see myself putting in a Ferrari driver, both on performance and or budget perspective, so those are off my list at this time. Now, the other sort of strategy I want to talk about is more about what happens if you change around your second constructor. Moving a Mercedes, again, because they're the cheapest constructor, I need to make another move elsewhere in order to afford a Ferrari or Red Bull. So it's tough to see what situation that would be in, but let's just say Ferrari look back on form again, then to get Ferrari back in, it would mean taking Max out or Oscar out. I then would have enough money to put in the George Russell sort of build. So here's a team with Oscar, Russell, McLaren, Ferrari that looks decent. The Red Bulls aren't looking great this weekend, but it also has to rely on Lewis and Charles and the Ferrari team actually getting their stuff together. So while that team is possible, I don't know if it's my favorite at the start of the week. Because I'm lacking flexibility, this Alonso for Bortoleto might be my one and only move this week. I think I am almost locked into this team, even though I haven't seen any data, which is kind of crazy. But I think generally I'm liking the look at what this team could offer me. There's some Russell and Antonelli shares in the Mercedes build. There is Max and Oscar. I can switch around that 2X after sprint qualifying to see which one I think is going to outperform the other. Got great B tier assets in Sainz and Alonso from budget and points potential this weekend. Just got to pray for no DNFs from Gasly at all. And as long as he finishes the sprint race, the qualifying, and the race, he won't lose me in the budget. And who knows, maybe there is a mild outside chance that maybe Gasly can score 6 points and scrape me a 0.2 million increase, which would be fantastic. Let me know down below what transfer combo you're going for, especially if you're taking a punt on sprint weekend risks. But as you can see, the strategy is beginning to play out, and it's how to best use 2 free transfers for this week and future weeks. Continuing the argument of do we build budget or chase points. The budget building play of getting an Alonso or a Lawson or both if you're able to, there is that short-term budget and point gain. Each of them are set to rise by 0.6 million. So just taking them out for someone like a Bortoleto, it certainly could be almost like a 1 million difference in change. It's a net swing in value. And we have to look at the importance of that. If you look at the gap between Verstappen and Norris, their value is 2 million right now. But after this weekend, with Verstappen likely to go up 0.6 and Norris to maybe go down 0.1, the gap's going to be down to 1.3 million. And that kind of budget flexibility could be huge for later in the season when you want to use a triple, like a 3X chip or the autopilot build. If you have the ability to get from a Verstappen into a Norris, and that's looking like where you want your team structure to go to, then the budget building play is still an option. But like I said earlier, if your budget is still around that 130 million level and below, 1 million may be able the difference between going from a Sainz to an Alonso to a Hadjar may not be as beneficial as, say, going from a Verstappen into a Norris, where there is that race win potential. We're just playing with a lot more points. So that is something to think about with your strategy. I did some analysis. I was looking at the total points that the second place constructor got in a week and the third place constructor. I took all their points, averaged them out. What I found was that the difference between the second highest constructor and the third highest constructor was about 12.6 points. And that's higher than most of your B tiers would even get. So the opportunity to move from a Ferrari to a Mercedes or Mercedes to a Red Bull, if you give yourself your flexibility there and give yourself that 3 or 4 million in the bank to be able to choose the right B tier constructors each given week, you could gain an extra 12.6 points just by doing that, which might seem more achievable and safer than it would be to sort of maybe pick up a Hadjar over Alonso or a Lawson over a Gasly, where unless there's a DNF, we don't see that big of a difference between the average B tier score and low. Of course, there's been some spike ones this week with Hulkenberg, Alonso, Albon, and Sainz. They are more the anomaly than the consistency. I do think that saving one transfer each week to pick the right constructor, there is some value to that. And option 3 with transfers is rolling a transfer. As you can see with my team options this week, I'm very limited what I can do because I'm on the edge of my budget, so there isn't much flexibility for me here. Which puts it at a strength to say maybe I do need to build a little bit more budget to give me that little bit more edge. But if you feel like you're not really anywhere close to that sort of budget building, then rolling a transfer to be able to make 3 transfers the following week could probably be a smart move to make. So if Aston could do well here, I may look at that Alonso, but it's just my one transfer. I think, again, I've spoken about it in previous videos. Alonso is a good longer-term hold, and again, would save me from future transfers. The one downside to this one is that I'm forced into keeping Gasly. Not a risk from a budget perspective, but certainly from a points perspective. And the DNF points are just going to be so brutal if Gasly hits that. The worst case scenario is he DNFs in the sprint, puts his car in a position where he can't partake in qualifying, gets another -5 there, and then gets another -20 in the race for that reason. Gasly comes with a lot of risks. The chances of that happening should be lower, but it's probably higher than most of the other assets on the track. But I don't really have much option to change him unless I was to move out a Max or a Piastri. So, as the start of the week, most of the transfers at this point tend to look around budget and what my future might hold for me. And as we get into some data, free practice 1 and sprint qualifying, we'll be able to make better educated guesses on whether we move around our 2X driver, our constructor, or roller transfers into the following week. All right, before we wrap up, let's talk chips. So we're entering the crunch time in F1 Fantasy. Sprint weekends like Austin are exactly where chips can swing your season. So we could be looking at a big raise in your ranks if you play your chips correctly. Now, wildcard, we have 70% of the top 500 managers have used it already. So there's about 30% of you that still have it left. If you're one of them, this could be a prime window. The sprint quality is going to give us loads of data, and you can lock that in. I feel like maybe the game is starting to stabilize a little bit, making it a good time to shift into a new team structure or meta. If you feel like McLaren's dominance is starting to fade, you can get off those assets. But if you think that McLaren's dominance may return, it is going to be time to lock them back in again. Alternatively, if you're playing mini leagues, you still have your wild card available, you could possibly continue to hold the wild card for a possible late shakeup. So final fix. So about 50% of the top 500 have used it. Again, final fix could be something that you lose for this. Final fix could be used this weekend for the sprint quali, especially if we're not feeling great about our autopilot or our 3X driver chip. Coming from the Verstappen Oscar build, I'm hoping one of them is going to look good enough that I would feel confident to use one of those chips, such as autopilot and 3X. But if I'm not too sure if Norris is looking good, Russell's looking good, and I don't have any shares, and I'm not sure if I want to get into them from a budget perspective, or I can't afford a Norris, then Final Fix could be used to my advantage this week. And here's the team that I'm looking at from a position. I could actually look into taking Oscar out and putting in Russell this week, which gives me flexibility, knowing that I can afford Oscar. Russell's going to stick in my team, going to see that 0.3 million increase. And then after sprint quali, I could take Russell out and put Oscar in for the rest of the weekend. So having McLaren driver in for the points for the sprint race, quali, and the race, but take the budget increase from George Russell, which could be worth 0.6 million just from that move alone. So there's a very good chance that I look into a final fix option for this week purely based on that. However, if it looks like Max and Oscar looking strong for 1, 2, 3 spots across the weekend in all scoring sessions, then this would be a prime weekend to pop on the autopilot or the triple captain. It's still under 30% usage among the top players, so there's huge differential points remaining. So if I'm confident in the 2X driver, sprint weekends is definitely a good time to use it. There's more points on the table. There could be multiple drivers available for that chip this week: Max, Piastri, Lando. If I don't use it now, I still want to use one of these on a sprint weekend, and so I'm pretty much locked into using them into Brazil or Qatar. I'm seeing myself getting backed into a corner if I don't use one of those chips this weekend, but I'm okay keeping it if I feel like I can take advantage of another chip, such as a final fix. Ultimately, chip usage is all about timing. It's not just for points, it's also about positioning your team. We have a few races left, so maximizing the upside may be worth more than saving theoretical perfection later. So we're just going to play it smart, adapt to the meta, and see how things go. So in summary, transfers are getting more valuable as we reach the business end of the season. Rolling the transfers might become your most powerful asset. Budget building still matters at more of the height, I would say. Chasing points on a sprint weekend could actually be the sharpest play right now. Let's look for the upgrades to see what teams bring to Austin. Let's see how their performance looks in free practice 1 and sprint quali. Prepare for some unexpected DNF, some position swings. And once again, thanks again for tuning in. Good luck for your team selection. I will catch you again after free practice 2 later this week. Have a good one.